Like the maple cream candy, usually they're teenagers. Not surprising. Many places have helped me with the research, the archives, and so on. And stay tuned.
So Carolyn, just before you rush away, do you have time for, do you have about 5 minutes or so? Opportunity for some questions, comments?
Just a question. When you, the second last slide where you talked about religion, it was striking. There are no Anglicans on there. Right? So do they actually have, so do we think that they're creating their own cookbook?
You know what, that's one I missed, and it's probably, there were some. The information varies between Church of England and Anglican and Episcopal are all listed, and I should have, yeah, that's my error. But a good supposition there.
But it's interesting that given the list that you've got there, that must be relative to the demographic.
Yes, yes.
I know.
Yeah, and I would like to compare it. There is statistics on the proportion of religions, and I'd like to compare. There's a lot of statistical things I could get into in the future with this cookbook to see whether they truly are representative of the Berlin population. I know there were people of Jewish faith in town, they're not in here. There were people who were Chinese, they're not in here. There's what would be considered minority groups who lived in town are not in here. There's only 1 or 2 Baptists, I think. But again, that faith was growing at this point.
Yeah. Do you know whether all of the recipes were accepted? And would you imagine that the people who were coordinating would ever test any of them?
She was asking about whether all recipes were accepted and whether the coordinators tested them. As for testing, I don't think so. Partly because of the multiples of some of the same recipe, essentially. And some of them didn't turn out, and I don't think it was just me misinterpreting things. I mean, there's certainly with detective work. I'm not working as far back as Fort York, but I still had to figure out, you know, how many raisins make a box of raisins in 1906 and things like that. As to whether we're all accepted, I don't know, and that's one of my frustrating parts is there's no information about what this cookbook was fundraising for. It's a fundraiser, but there's been no information on that. I'm still trying to look. I've ruled out some things. The YWCA was getting started. It's not it. The hospital had a women's auxiliary. As far as I can tell, they weren't fundraising using the cookbook. And I would love to find information about, you know, the call for recipes, a request. Was it through a church? Was it, because it's not a fundraiser for a church with so many different denominations. So it's a bit of a mystery, and it may be for a while yet. Any other questions? Yeah?
What is the sad part of Agnes's story?
Okay. Well, first off, she's widowed. But then life turns around. You know, her children are married. She goes to Costa Rica to see her son. She returns. She gets in a car accident in Hamilton and dies. And the next year, her son, the one in Costa Rica, dies shortly after his first child is born. Now, I found all this out because I was able to connect up with a descendant of them. This is so far the only one I've managed to do this. Lives in BC. I found him through Ancestry.ca, and he had pictures of this woman. Because my goal is not to use representative photos, but to actually have pictures of these people so they can be reclaimed as individuals instead of representative. So he provided that letter and the information about what happened next, her obituary and so on. Yeah.
I have 2 quick questions. Sure. What was your favorite recipe? And number 2, what was the best recipe in there with cheese in it?
Well, at least one of the Welsh rarebit recipes is really good. And there's one for cheese pudding, which is kind of an odd thing. It's basically bread pudding made with cheese. It's a savory pudding. And I liked it. Now, I can't have dairy, and I don't like eggs, so some of these recipes were really challenging. I went ahead and did them. My favorite, I think, well, there's two. There's a chocolate cake recipe, but there's Mrs. Dare's cocoa sticks. Really fiddly to make, and this is the Dare of Dare cookies. Yeah. Her recipe is the longest in the cookbook. One for eclairs. Second longest is the one for cocoa sticks, because she gives so much detail in the recipe of what temperature, what. I don't think she has a home economics background, but I'm beginning to wonder if she had major influence on her husband's cookies. Oh, yes.
Is there an assumption about what sort of cooking facility people have?
I don't think so. It usually doesn't give a temperature. In fact, it never gives a temperature beyond, medium or slow, that kind of thing. Gas was in town. There was gas lighting. I think for most of them it would be a coal-fired cook stove, but this is the period where a lot of the cooking equipment is starting to change, so I'm not sure. There's going to be women cooking in essentially tenement housing and women cooking on farms, women supervising in wealthy homes, so it really ranges. And again, I think it's one of those things where anyone buying it at the time could find recipes that spoke to her. There are 3 men who contributed recipes too.
Yeah, for what?
Oh, for what? I keep leaving you in suspense. Mr. Burlette was a tailor, and he contributed a recipe had to do with clothes. It was a laundry one. There was a barber who contributed a recipe for a hair tonic. And Nina's brother contributed one for an egg drink. Sort of like, well, not as good as eggnog. It was more like something they called Boston cream. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for a fascinating presentation, and we're so delighted that you could make time to be with us here today.
That was a fun morning.